All right, welcome to Symbolic Logic that is now completely online. Today, we're going to start with a brief recap of where we've been in the course up till now, and I'm going to realize how much I touch my face, so I'm going to try not to do that, and I'm going to try to also not ad-lib too much. I'm going to try to avoid those types of things that I sometimes do in lecture. All right, so back to it. So I'm going to do a quick review of the things that we've done up until now, and then start with the introduction today, which will be on quantification. So I'm going to use the whiteboard here. So let me just bear with me as I'm still learning how to do this efficiently. Great, okay. So to recap, right, this whole course has been about moving from a language. Let's see if this pen works. No, it does not. So we've moved from a, that's definitely not going to work. Let me just use text here. We've moved from a language, and then what we've done is we've studied that language in terms of its logic, right? And we've always started with the language part, and then we've studied the logic, and then we would go back and we make our language a little bit more complicated, and then we would study its logic. And what we've developed in terms of the first order logic language that we've learned so far has included the connectives of negation. We have disjunction, we've got conjunction. We've also added now the material conditional, that was the arrow, and then as well as the biconditional. Oh gosh, that's terrible. And in terms of the logics we've learned, we've used various types of proofs, particularly the big proof strategies that we spent a lot of time on is the disjunction elim, which is proof by cases in English, but in Fitch we call this disjunction elim. In Fitch we also had negation introduction, which we called proof by contradiction. So negation intro. I realize I'm going to have to get a better pen or system for doing this instead of my mouse. And then we also, the other big one was the conditional introduction, which was the conditional proof. So this is where we've been, this is where we've gotten to in the course, right? We have all these connectives now, and we've got various types of inferences that we're able to do in Fitch, and then we've also learned the various types of proof strategies, and in particular, these natural deduction types of proofs, proof by cases, proof by contradiction, and then conditional proofs. One of the key features of all of these connectives so far is that they are truth functional. So what that means is that they take the meanings of the parts, in particular, they take the truth values of the parts, and then they aggregate them in some way to then have the truth value of the whole. Right? So for a conjunction will be true just in case each of the components is true. Okay, well, I'm going to clear all this. What we're going to work on, or what we're going to start today, is quite a different concept from this. And we're going to do an introduction to quantification. I think I'm going to try to stick with the drawing the typing as much as I can. So with quantification, we're going to move away from truth functionality. And what we're going to try to do is capture some features of English that deal with what are called determiners. So determiners are words like every, the, can be a specific number, like 3 little pigs. The word 3 there would be the determiner. Others include like most. I already said, I believe, the. One of the things that these types of words do is they provide a quantified expression. So let's give some example of things that we've used in class. Compare 3 different types of arguments. One says all quiddos are bimplas. Brad is a quiddo, therefore Brad is a bimpla. This is the type of argument that we've looked at the beginning of the class. And again, remember, I've just made up these predicates. They're totally meaningless. But that doesn't matter because what we're still looking at are the logical aspects of what's being expressed in the language. So this argument is a valid one. Compare that to an argument where instead of starting with all, we start with some quiddos are bimplas. Brad is a quiddo, therefore Brad is a bimpla. This argument is not valid. The reason for it is that it's possible to make the premises true, but the conclusion false. And in particular, the key difference here is the difference between the word some and the word all. Right? When we use the word all over here, we mean every single one of those objects that counts as a quiddo is an object that is also a bimpla. So if we know that Brad is one of those quiddos, then we automatically know that he's also one of the bimplas. Over here, when we say the word some, we're saying, hey, look, there's some objects that have the property of being a quiddo, and of those, some of them are going to be bimplas as well. But it doesn't guarantee that every single object that's a quiddo is also a bimpla. Right? There might be some quiddos that are not bimplas, and this first sentence would still be true. It just means some of the quiddos are bimplas. So for all we know, Brad might be one of the quiddos that is a bimpla, or Brad might also be an object that is a quiddo, but not a bimpla. So the word some doesn't guarantee that every quiddo is in fact a bimpla. And so that means we can generate a counterexample, right? We can make these 2 premises true, but make the conclusion false. All right, so the idea of quantification has to do with these terms, all and some. And so that's what we're going to do in this next phase of logic when we make our language more complex. We're going to focus on these types of quantifiers. Now, we're not going to deal with every type of quantification in English. We're going to focus specifically on 2. So let me clear this. So there are going to be 2 types of quantifiers that we work with. The first one is called universal quantification, or the universal quantifier. And the second one is called the existential quantifier. And we're going to give them symbols. The universal quantifier is the upside down A. And the existential quantifier is the backwards E. If you end up typing up some of these quantifiers in Microsoft Word, for example, you'll have to look for these symbols to be able to use them. You should be able to see what the shorthand key is for those. If you don't, you can just use instead, like if you're typing these up for your homeworks, I will accept, you can just write all for the universal quantifier, and for the existential, you can write exists and just put them in all caps. And that way I know, okay, you're talking about the particular quantifiers there. Okay, so the universal quantifier is the one that we used when we talked about every or all quiddos are BIMPLAs. And the existential quantifier is the one where we say, some quiddos are BIMPLAs. In addition to the quantifiers, we also need to introduce a concept of a variable. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about how these look and give you a couple examples of them. And then in the next video, we'll go into a little bit more detail about how to formulate new sentences that use them. So the other concept that we need in addition to a quantifier is what's called a variable. The variables that we're going to use, remember we had lowercase Roman numerals. So we had, for example, So we had, for names, or what we sometimes called constants, we had like A, B, C, D, or then we would have N with little subscripts, right? There'd be like subscript 1, or we could use N subscript 2, and we would never run out of names. The variables now we're going to use, there we go, are going to be using the end of the alphabet. So we'll use X, Y, Z, and if we're worried about running out, we can use X like subscript 1, X subscript 2, and so forth. Now, one of the key things to remember is that variables are not names or not constants. The key feature of a name is that it picks out an object in the domain of discourse, or in Tarski's world, right? So when we used the, say the name A, right, there was some object, maybe a square, and that square could be named A. And A was only allowed to name one object. An object could have multiple names, right? But if we had a name like A, that would have to name an object in the domain of discourse or in Tarski's world, and it could only name one thing. Variables are not names. They are not going to pick out or refer to specific objects in the domain. They're going to be sort of placeholders, and I think it'll make a little more sense when we do some examples. So let's say we want to, we're talking about, given the current situation, that everybody is home. So we're using the word everybody, so that's a universal quantifier. So we're going to use the upside down A to indicate that we're using a universal quantifier. And we're going to use this variable beside it to say that X could apply to any of the objects in the domain. And we're going to do so universally. And I'm going to use a predicate home, or is home, but to spare you me having to watch me do all this writing, I'm just going to use the word home. And I'm going to put in parentheses X. So notice, if I wanted to say that Max was home, right, I would write down home, and then I would have a name in the in this argument position, right? I would say Max. That's how we would write that Max is home in our first order language. So here I've got a name right there. When we write quantified sentences, we're going to introduce these variables. And so the variable, again, is not a name. You can think of it as a sort of a very brief temporary label. And that temporary label can be applied to anything in the domain of discourse or in Tarski's world. And what we're saying is every object in the domain or in Tarski's world is home. One of the things that we're going to do when we have the universal quantifier is we're often going to connect it with the conditional. So if we want to say that all doctors are smart, or all Academy Award winners are, excuse me, all Academy Award winners are famous, using some examples that we've looked at in the past, what we're going to do is combine the quantifiers with the conditional. So we can say things like, for all x, if someone is, say, home, that should be an X right there. We might want to say, okay, everybody who's home is being safe. So what this says is every object that satisfies the condition of being home is sufficient for also satisfying this condition of being safe. Notice that the concepts that we've talked about using the material conditional, right, where we said that home here is the sufficient condition and safe here, this is the consequent, is the necessary condition. So we're still going to be reusing those concepts. So this is the antecedent, home, and this is the consequent. And this first part, this antecedent, is sufficient for the consequent. And in turn, the consequent is necessary for this first part. Right? So this doesn't mean the reverse, which is that everything that's safe is also being home. Right? That's not what this is saying. This is saying that being home is a sufficient condition for being safe. And we're saying, because we've got the universal quantifier up front, that everything in the domain should be satisfying this condition if this sentence as a whole is true. So you'll get lots more practice with how we combine the universal quantifier with the conditional as we've used it. If you've forgotten a little bit about the conditional, go back and remind yourself about how the conditional works and the truth functional aspects of this, right? So that the only time that the conditional is false is when the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false. If you do have questions about this, please send me an email and I can provide you some review materials. But my first suggestion is just go back and remind yourself of how the material conditional works just by reviewing that chapter again. Okay, so that's the universal quantifier, and you'll see how we use that more with the conditional. The existential quantifier is not going to be used with the conditional as much. In fact, there's going to be some confusions that we're going to try to avoid. So we're going to try to not combine the existential quantifier with the material conditional. The existential quantifier works just like the universal quantifier in terms of what we're going to call binding with the variables. And I'm going to talk about binding and the difference between bound variables and free variables in the next video lecture. For now, to just get a feel for it, we can use the existential quantifier. Again, that's that backwards E. And we're going to say that something is home. There's at least one thing that's home. So again, we'll have this predicate. And rather than having a name in this argument position, like we did up here when we said that Max is home, we're going to use a variable instead. And this is saying that there's at least one thing in the domain of discourse, right? Or Tarski's world, if that's the domain that we're working in. And we're saying there's at least one object in the domain of discourse that satisfies this predicate. namely of being home. So if Sally, say, is at the library and the library is not her home, then this would be false if that was the only thing in the domain that we're talking about. But if we're talking about the domain of people, say in Idaho, there are going to be some people who may be at the library, there might be some people who are at home, and then this sentence would be true as long as there's at least one person that could be put into this argument position that then satisfies this predicate. Okay, so that's your brief introduction to the quantifiers. I should let you know that this is it in terms of all the symbols that we're going to learn for the rest of this course. So we are now done in terms of going through that loop of going under, introducing a more complex language, and then going back and introducing the logic or studying that logic for that language. We are now done in terms of all the symbols that you're going to see for this class. So if you open up Tarski's world and you see all those symbols in that top right-hand corner, you should be familiar with just about all of them at this point, and hopefully they're not nearly as scary as they might have been when we started. For the next video lecture, I'm going to then talk about the difference between free and bound variables and provide you with some additional examples. I appreciate you being really patient as we try to figure out how to put all these courses online, and I would appreciate any type of feedback that you have for how to improve this, or if there's any mistakes that you caught, if I misspoke, to please let me know.